This is a Trident Disabilities audio archive recording read by Toya Paul. The book is entitled The Road by Elias Tobenkin, author of Vitae Arrives, published by Harcourt, Brace and Company, New York. Copyright 1922 by Harcourt, Brace and Company, Incorporated. Printed in the USA by the Quinn and Bowden Company, Rahway, New Jersey. To Paul on his 8th birthday. Give me again, O nature, your primal sanities. Walt Whitman. Book 1, Road's Beginning. Chapter 1, Hilda. When Hilda Thornton opened her eyes, she was still lying on the operating table. The room seemed to be filled with vapor, and she could distinguish neither the doctor nor the nurses. She heard them speak, but their voices had a faraway, muffled sound. The feeling of remoteness extended also to her thoughts. They seemed to be floating about in the atmosphere like so many red and blue balloons, and she was unable to get them back into her head where she knew they belonged. She mastered them finally and crowded them back into her brain. Now she could think. She had been waiting for something, wanting to know. What was it? Oh, yes, she recalled. She was anxious to know whether it was all over, or whether the thing had not yet begun. She must raise herself and see. Raise herself she did not. In the next breath, she joined the red and blue balloons and was swinging through space with them. When she opened her eyes for the second time, she was in bed in a ward with other patients. The light in the room was dim, but her vision was clear, and from her limbs all numbness was gone. Noiselessly, an attendant was wheeling out a stretcher upon which she was brought in. It was all over. She was aware of it almost before opening her eyes. She felt that she was on the eve of a great celebration. An air of festivity hung over everything. She was tired, but the tiredness did not keep her from feeling the unwanted and mysterious thrill that was coursing through her from head to foot. The doctor was standing beside the bed, gazing at her, and a feeling of shame seized her. She was abashed over her condition, the thing she had just come out of. She must apologize to him, thank him for what he had done for her. She was extending her hand to him. Reason had broken through the last filmy wall of unconsciousness. She realized what she was about and shrank back in panic. The thing she had dreaded before taking the anesthetic, the irrepressible craving to talk, to confide, to yield, this thing was upon her. It was one of the inevitable accompaniments of the drug. She wondered whether she had not already said something out of the way. She could not tell from the expression in the doctor's face. At any rate, she would take herself in hand immediately. Her future was in the balance. It could be destroyed with a careless word. She shook as if she had taken something bitter. Her features became tense with determination. The physician noted the excitement under which she labored. "Feeling well?" he asked. "Yes," Hilda replied, turning her eyes away. The doctor made a move as if to go, but changed his mind and remained. It was Sunday, and it was nearly midnight. Dr. Gilbert Norton, house physician at the Swan Maternity Hospital, had just gone through one of the most thrilling experiences of his still young practice. After a trying delivery, He had worked himself into a sweat before he finally found the voice for the puny infant. Never had he seen a child so obstinate in its refusal to come to life. He was still vibrating with excitement over his success in saving the infant's life, and was not averse to sharing the thrill of the achievement with the young mother. He was waiting for her to speak, to ask about her child. The child, whether it was well and what it was, a boy or a girl. These were the first questions mothers ask upon coming to. It was time Hilda asked these questions. She was completely out from under the influence of the anesthetic and was in full possession of her senses. Dr. Norton waited, but she was not asking. She was not speaking. Nor did he feel encouraged to start a conversation. Hilda was not sleeping, but she had closed her eyes. She apparently wished to be left alone. They had not taken her story of widowhood seriously at the hospital, but they were not making any distinctions between married and unmarried cases, and they were not prying into any girl's past. Dr. Norton had from the first taken Hilda to be unmarried and her child illegitimate. The girl's conduct, her tensity and silence, at a time when she should relax, should speak, not only tended to confirm this view, but gave him occasion for further reflection. The case plainly was one of more than ordinary tragedy. The child was more than unwanted. That all illegitimate children were. It was a dread and burden to its mother. Nor could he condemn the girl for apparently feeling that way toward the infant. Hilda was so young. He had taken her to be a country girl who had been betrayed, ruined. Everything about her seemed to bear out this view. There was nothing of the city's slums about her face or in her speech. Not a trace of wantonness, of coarseness. In spite of her condition, the girl retained about herself an air of innocence. As he meditated over these things, Dr. Norton was wondering whether his luck in saving the infant's life, upon which he had been congratulating himself, was luck or was but the irony of fate. His frantic efforts had apparently forced into life only that which might have been better dead. However, having almost miraculously saved the child's life, he was not going to take chances on having it snuffed out by a crazed mother. He took one final look at Hilda and left the room. In the hall, he gave the nurse strict orders. A careful watch was to be kept over the girl, especially when the child was with her. She was laboring under a great strain, and there was no telling when she might go into hysterics and attempt to smother the infant. While the physician was speaking to the nurse, Hilda was making the most of these few unguarded moments. With a violent effort, she raised her head and let her gaze glide slowly, searchingly down the length of her even, slender body. She had anticipated this moment for months and would not deprive herself of the ecstasy which this drinking in of the sight of her transformation gave her, even if the strain of holding up her head was too much for her exhausted frame. Yes, it was all over. The words had a joyous sound in her ears. Whatever might come next, with this thing she was through. She was her former self again. Moreover, nothing really bad could happen to her now. Giving birth was what she dreaded most, and that was over. She was actually herself, just herself again after 8 months. 8 months! Were they only months? They had seemed to her like years, ages. But whatever they had been, they were ended. She would blot them out. She would banish them from her memory as one banishes a bad dream. The future, her brain was in a riot over the future. She was making plans, all sorts of plans. Everything would be well now, must be well. And all her clothes would fit her again. She was transported with joy, with relief. The nurse came. Was there anything she wished? Ice? She could have ice. But Hilda wanted nothing. No, she felt no nausea, no pain. She was just tired. She wanted to sleep. She closed her eyes. She meant to keep them closed until the nurse was out of the room. Then she would drop this pose of being sleepy and would go on with her thoughts, with her ecstasies. But she was more tired than she herself was aware of. In a few moments, she was sleeping. She woke as suddenly as she had gone to sleep. The spring night was at an end, but the sun had not yet risen. Gray dawn was breaking into the room and gave the frail light on the nurse's table a timid aspect. The other patients were sound asleep. It was several moments before Hilda recalled where she was and the occasion for her being there. The thought of the child struck her like a hammer blow. She had given birth to a child. That was the significance of her surroundings, of the strange night she had passed. What for months, weary, interminable months, had been but a nameless trouble to her, something to grit her teeth at, to hate blindly, had come to an issue. It was a human entity now, a child. Detached from her own flesh, it was now lying someplace near, perhaps in an adjoining room, lying and waiting for her. It was with herself only Hilda had thus far been concerned. With regard to the child, her mind was made up. She would not have it, of course. It would go the way all such children went. There were institutions for them, foundling homes in the big city. That was why she came to New York. The process of actual transfer of the child from herself to an institution she had never considered. While the child was unborn, there were always more poignant things to think about. She left these details for after. Now it was after. She must have a definite plan. She must have the child taken from her before she left the hospital. Yes, before. She meant to go out into the world again with her slate wiped clean of this experience. Into the world. Her heart began to beat faster at the thought. She saw a street, Broadway. She was walking down Broadway in her summer dress, for she would never go to Chicago again, never go near home. It would be just the season to wear this dress by the time everything was over. She gazed down the length of the bed of her body and fell to listening to herself. She was fascinated by the ease which every part of her body radiated. It was unbelievable. But the pain of yesterday, of those weeks and months, was gone. It had utterly disappeared. There was none of that blind tugging at her vitals. She was light and free. It was an exquisite feeling. She was intensely happy. The cold morning air was taking the crispness out of this ecstasy before she had more than quaffed it. The problem of the child was at her throat again. Now she could no longer shrink from this thought. It had to be faced. The child was there, under the same roof with her. She would soon see it. They would bring it to her. What was she to do with it? How was she to dispose of it? She was limp with weakness, and she suddenly made a discovery. She had been hasty when she believed herself entirely free from pain. The strain and heaviness had not altogether left her. They had merely shifted to her head. Her head felt aching, battered. The child. Through the slightly raised window, gusts of pale morning air were filtering into the room. She was cold and drew the blanket up to her chin. With the warmth came a feeling of rest, of tranquility. The problem of the child was receding. It was disappearing altogether. There was no child. It was dead, was born dead. She was afraid. She had always been afraid of people after they were dead. It was a weakness of hers from childhood on. She had been afraid even of her mother when she died, and the night before the funeral, they had to take her to a neighbor to sleep. Often in later years, she had regretted that she had not spent that last night under the same roof with her mother. She had never quite forgiven herself for that neglect. The blanket was stealthily pushing its way up. It now covered her face and eyes, and she had no more fears. Thoughts of the future came once more. But she waved them aside. That was no time to think about the future, with the child lying in the next room dead. She was thinking about the funeral. She must see to it that the child was given a decent burial. She would insist on it. The funeral was over. She was now alone in the world, but she was unafraid. Life had no terrors for her now. She knew how to meet it. Yes, she would manage her life differently, better. The first thing she would do would be to look for a job out of her line. She was sick of the factory. She would look for a job in a store or maybe in an office. Yes, in an office. Why had she always been so afraid of office work? Some office jobs paid as good as the factory, even from the start. And her education was as good as that of many a girl who had worked in an office. She always had been good in spelling. In fact, she was very nearly at the top of her class in almost everything. She might even manage to go to a business college nights. Several girls she had known in Chicago were attending business college evenings. Of course, those girls had homes and parents. She too would have gone to business college if her mother had been alive. Her mother, she recalled faintly, often used to speak of business college. She regretted that she had not gone to one herself, and she hoped that she, Hilda, would. But that was long ago. It was when her mother was well yet. Strange how pale and indistinct the memory of her mother had become. And yet she was not so young when her mother died. She was 8 years. But what was this? Her mother was alive. She was standing beside her bed, and her face was radiant. In her arms, she held a baby. It was her baby, and her mother was cooing to it delightedly. "He is so sweet," her mother was saying of the infant, "and I am so lonely. I shall take him with me to heaven." Hilda opened her eyes. The nurse was laying a quilted bundle close to her side. The sun was out and the early morning mist had disappeared. Several women were sitting up in their beds, craning their necks in the direction of Hilda and the nurse. "Your son," the nurse chatted cheerfully, "has been calling for his breakfast." She examined Hilda's breast and next began maneuvering her left arm about the quilted bundle. The infant was apparently asleep again. It was quiet. The face of the child was covered, and for this Hilda was thankful. She needed a breathing space to prepare herself for the new role. There, we are ready now, the nurse finally announced. And putting away the cotton and boric acid, she drew aside the cloth from the little face. Hilda's heart stood still. The nurse had manipulated her hand and body so that she felt a velvety touch against her breast, and now the nurse was talking to her softly. She was initiating her into the secret of a mother's first feeding. But Hilda did not half hear her. Her mind was far away, and a mist rose before her eyes. It was in Chicago 10 months earlier. Raymond Evert had written her to meet him at 8 o'clock that evening. She was at the appointed place, but he had not yet arrived. 10 minutes passed, 20, half an hour. Still, he was not there. She grew impatient. She was worried. The twilight was deepening. Finally, she spied a figure, a mere shadow, far down the street, whose walk was suggestive of Raymond. She waited with beating heart. The figure was approaching at a rapid pace. In a few seconds, the outlines of the body became pronounced, more like Raymond. Another instant, and she recognized his features in the dusk, recognized them before she was able clearly to discern them. She was experiencing the same sensation now. Looking at the tiny face of the infant was like seeing Raymond a great way off. She had a feeling that she needed but to wait, and Raymond would come swinging himself nearer and nearer as he did that July evening in Chicago. She became faint. Her arm released the infant. The child dropped the breast and was crying. Hilda's trance-like reveries were broken. "You must not let yourself become so agitated," the nurse said sternly. "It is not good for the baby." When the infant was eating once more and the folds had straightened out on its tiny face, the nurse began speaking softly again. The child was greatly underweight, not quite 5 pounds, and would require a great deal of care and patience until it was brought around to a point where it would be like the average in body and strength. But the youngster was worth all the trouble she would take with him, she cheered Hilda. She should have seen it when it had its eyes open. They were big and blue, and they shone like 2 stars. And what a will of his own the little one had. She described the resistance the infant had put up at birth, and she praised Dr. Norton. Any other physician would have given the child up for dead. Hilda, who had had a desire to clasp the little one and bring it up close to her face, was sent off dreaming again by the recital. When nurse and baby were gone, she stared at her empty arm. The sensation which the pressure of the child against her flesh had left was evaporating like a delicate perfume. If the child, too, could evaporate like that, she thought. If her agitation, her grief, her all-consuming fear could but transform themselves into a dream from which there would be relief on waking. From her arm, her gaze traveled to her breast. There was a drop of milk on it. She wiped it. It felt strange and tender. Pains were coming over her, and she had let her head sink back on the pillow. She felt the tears running down her cheeks, but she was powerless to stem them. She was trembling from head to foot. It seemed to her that she was falling to a great depth. If someone would only help her, if a friend would only give her a hand, if only Raymond were there. Raymond, Raymond. She pressed the pillow to her face and sobbed. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the nurse brought the infant for the second feeding. Hilda had calmed down. She strained her every muscle to make the child comfortable in her arms, and she succeeded. It was eating greedily. The nurse praised her for her quick adaptability and hurried off to another bed to look at another babe. By the time the feeding was over, Hilda was bathed in perspiration. The infant had fallen asleep at the breast, and she was afraid to stir lest she wake it, and it began to cry. She was glad when the child was taken from her and she could close her eyes and rest. They woke her out of a sound sleep for her dinner. Hilda gazed at the room and the people as if she were seeing them for the first time. They did not seem the same to her. Nothing was the same. She wished she had a mirror and could look at herself. It seemed to her that she too must look different now. She felt different. As she ate, she remembered faintly that when the nurse woke her, she was in the midst of something momentous, something that was shedding a great light, was lifting a great load from her mind. It was a dream, of course, but what was it? When she had finished her meal, she closed her eyes and summoned all her strength to recall what it was she had been dreaming. And suddenly she found the ends of the broken thread and tied them together. Her thoughts flowed on once more. But they were not thoughts, they were pictures. She was viewing a series of pictures. They were hazy at first, but gradually the haze seemed to be rolling more and more into the distance, and the pictures stood out clearly. She described a little boy on his way to school. His shoes were old and much too big for his small feet. His clothes fitted illy. His hair and ears were neglected, and his face had that seriousness which comes to children that have never known their parents. The little boy was bigger now and was going to work. There were several buttons missing in his coat, and he still had the timid look which characterized him as a child. He was older, a young man. He was straight and tall, with a kind face and quiet manners. He was married. He had children. It was her son. They were her grandchildren. They passed her on the street, but they did not know her. She ran after them. She called, but her voice was weak, and they were lost in the crowd. She would never see them again. And she was an old woman. Hilda woke from her half-slumber, clinging to her last visionings, determined to drag them out from the realm of dreams and making sure that not a detail of the picture she had been viewing escaped her. The women patients now lay or sat up cheerfully and contented. There was always peace and contentment in the ward after the noon meal. Hilda, however, experienced a sensation of packing and moving. She had no idea where she was going, but she was going. She was moving away from herself, from her old life. This old life of hers seemed like a dress that she had slipped off and which would never fit her again. The child would never be altogether out of her life. It was not this way she had imagined having a child. The physical barriers between herself and the infant would not extend to her thoughts. In thought, she would be with the child through growth, sickness, trouble, until death closed her eyes. All her former plans were blurred. A breeze was sweeping into the room, a soft spring breeze. It reminded her of the afternoon in September when she sat by the lake in Chicago, looking down into its blue waters, thinking of her misfortune and wondering whether to choose the blue waters or to choose New York. Why did her courage fail her? Why did she not end it all then? Why was she not at the bottom of Lake Michigan? The head nurse herself brought the child for the afternoon feeding. Miss Hurlburt was close to 40. She was slightly above middle height and round of figure. Her skin was of transparent whiteness. She had been earning her livelihood in the hospitals in New York since her 17th year and was thoroughly familiar with the shadowy side of life in the great city. She was tactful and easily won the confidence of her patients. She had come to get acquainted with Hilda. Dr. Norton had sent her to see if she could not be of service to the girl. But Miss Hurlburt was not intruding, neither with words nor looks. Hilda had learned to adjust herself better and found the process of feeding less of a strain. She was not so tired and observed the child as it nursed. The resemblance between the infant and Raymond, on close observation, was even greater than had appeared to her at the first glance. For an instant she was tempted to speak to the infant about Raymond, but she saw the absurdity of it, and a smile broke over her face. It was the first time she had smiled in many months, and it was brief. Hilda felt as if she had done something out of the way in permitting herself to smile, and proceeded with her examination of the infant. The child had fallen away from the breast, and the tiny lips still puckered from clinging to the nipple. Its eyes were wide open, and they were everything the nurse had bespoken for them. They were big and blue, and to Hilda they were even more. They were familiar, reminiscent. The child was not the intruding, hateful stranger she had been expecting in those 8 months. It belonged in her life. It seemed a part of the wonderful summer she and Raymond had spent together, of the Sundays on the lake, in the parks, in the fields. Tenderly, so as not to expose it to the breeze, she undid the child's blanket. The infant was wrapped in an ill-fitting shirt that must have served scores of other children before. She had not, of course, thought of preparing clothes for it, and now a feeling of guilt came over her. She was ashamed. She had treated the mite shabbily. The tiny body of the infant was in view. The limbs were thin and long, skin and bones. She covered the little body quickly and turned to the infant's face once more. The nurse, in passing, told her that she was coming for the child in a few minutes, and a wave of excitement suddenly came over Hilda. She experienced a sensation as if the child was about to be taken from her forever, and there was something to do at once, quick. She was trying to think what it was she must do. A memory came to her, a recent memory. It was just about a week before she went to the hospital. She was sitting in her room alone. She had already ceased to go to work. She had sat through the morning and the greater part of the afternoon, brooding. It had been raining steadily, and she could stand it no longer. A sudden resolution came upon her. She turned on the gas jet on the wall above her head and laid down to die. The gas odors were trickling down to her slowly. She felt a sweetness, a nausea. Soon it would be over. She would sleep, she would rest, she would forget all. She was glad she had the courage to do this thing at last. And then a wild cry arose. Something was crying within her. 1,000 voices seemed raised in alarm. She gathered all her strength, rose, and took a step to the window. It required great effort to raise it, but she succeeded. The air revived her. Just such an alarm was rising within her now. Confused voices were pleading, crying, protesting. They were weeping for the child. Her whole being wept, and the tears were sweeping everything before them. Her plans, her future, her own happiness, they mattered not. Nothing mattered except life, the life of the child. She would not dim this life. Poor babe, she attempted to speak, but the tears were choking off her breath. No, no. The words stormed in her brain. The hatred she had nurtured in those months of doubt were intended for someone else, for some other child, a child she did not know. Not for him. He was her son, come what will. She would live for him. She would suffer for him. And happy to a point of hysteria, she brought her face down, close to the bundled up human parcel, and covered the child with tender, mumbling kisses.